Hello everybody, welcome to CG Unscripted, a show that talks about all things computer graphics related, including 3D animation, motion graphics, visual effects, filmmaking, storytelling, post-production, and more. In this case, for this episode, we're going to talk about editing. Adobe has recently released a new PDF/book about advanced workflows in editing. And I took a look at it and thought that it was an important book. So I'm going to do like a review here where we're going to review the book and talk about it, talk about some different chapters in the book. It may not be a book printed on paper as in a traditional sense, but it is a book. It's just an electronic book. So without further ado, let's take a look at it and see how this book/guide can help you when designing advanced workflows with Premiere Pro and related applications. So here's the book. It's the Adobe Premiere Pro Best Practices and Workflow Guide for Long-Form and Episodic Post-Production. So if you're a one-person operation, and you're working with maybe one or two other artists or something like that, some of this information might be, a little bit outside of your realm of your workflow, but you would probably benefit anyway from reading this publication because there's a lot of good information in it that you may or you may not be aware of. Plus, you never know when you're going to work on a really big production, whether it's a huge feature film, or it could be a reality TV show, or it could be an episodic series, television series, or on Netflix or on some sort of streaming service. Or you might be looking to set up a big production like that. Then you probably would want to read this document if you are planning to use Adobe Premiere Pro, which is used by a lot of independent filmmakers and producers and creators of long-form content. So let's take a look at what's inside. So it starts with a little introduction. Basically, and it talks about how Premiere Pro was used by people like director David Fincher and his team for Gone Girl, which was the first Hollywood film to be edited with Premiere Pro, as well as Tim Miller's Deadpool and the Coen brothers' Hail Caesar. So Premiere Pro is used, as well as other tools, in Hollywood, in television. I think amongst independent filmmakers, it might be among perhaps the most popular editing platform that is being used. I know that at the Sundance Film Festival and at Tribeca and other large film festivals, Premiere Pro was the editing tool that was used for the majority of the films. That's what the introduction is about. Next chapter, chapter 2, is going to talk about before getting started, and it gives you some little tips and tricks, before you really begin your production, things to keep in mind going into creating a large production in Premiere Pro. For example, it tells you that it says, never use the merge clips function in Premiere Pro to sync audio and video. The merge clips feature creates a new clip which does not retain the original audio metadata, which can block common audio turnover workflows. So they're telling you, instead of using the merge clips command, you can use a multicamera or multicam workflow to merge and sync footage to audio. So things like that, because that preserves the metadata. So things like that is talked about in this first chapter, just little things that have to do with like the media cache and scratch disks and things like that, GPU drivers. because when you're setting up your GPU, you want to make sure that you use the studio drivers and not the game drivers. If you're using like a GPU like an RTX, 3090 or 3070, 3080, something like that. So that's what this chapter is all about. The next chapter is called Hardware and Settings, and it goes over important concepts when setting up hardware to work on an editing job, a huge editing and post-production job with Premiere Pro as its center. And basically what it says here is it tells you, like, for example, CPU considerations. And one thing that I found interesting was that, it tells you that the sweet spot is 8 to 16 cores, but keep in mind that core speed matters. 8 fast cores, 3.5 and more gigahertz, are usually preferable to 20 slower cores at around 2 gigahertz. So if you had the choice between less cores and faster speed, faster gigahertz on the CPU, go for that rather than more cores and slower gigahertz. As well as different things, like they tell you to install Premiere Pro on like a fast NVMe boot drive. And you have a secondary fast SSD, internal or external, for the media cache files. And then for your footage files, you can put that on a huge sort of like traditional hard disk drive that has a lot of room on it and can be a little bit slower. But put the Premiere Pro app and the media cache on NVMe drive and SSD respectively. That was an interesting tip and an important tip to understand. And so on and so forth. It goes more into that. It talks about RAM, how much RAM you should have. And the GPU, more about the GPU, what's it used for. And like I said before, you want to use your studio drivers and not the game drivers. So, and here once again, we have like the boot drive should have the Premiere Pro on it. The cache drive should be a fast SSD dedicated to Premiere Pro. And your media drive should be, this drive holds your media and may sacrifice speed for a large capacity. But that kind of brings us to a different discussion. It's also talking about networking in this chapter. And, you want to choose the kind of Premiere Pro is flexible with the type of networks it can support. It's preferred 10 gigabit Ethernet speeds as a minimum, and other network protocols, especially later on we're going to talk about collaborative workflows, or this document talks about collaborative workflows, so we'll see how important network is. The hardware I/O monitoring talks about how to set up monitors for monitoring. Okay, so people that you don't have to watch it in a little Premiere Pro program window inside the editor. You can set up a separate monitor to just to monitor your picture as you would see it full screen, as you would see it on your television or in a theater or whatever. So that talks about that. System compatibility, media cache preferences. So all of these, you could read for yourself. It's just generally hardware considerations when you're setting up your system, and so on and so forth. Okay, collaboration preferences, memory preferences, playback preferences. And it talks about the Mercury playback engine, which is Premiere Pro's, GPU accelerated playback engine. Chapter 4, working with dailies. So when working on a large production, at the end of a shooting day, whether it's on a big movie set or if you're doing, if you're shooting somewhere like on a set somewhere, or let's say, wherever you're doing it in a studio. What happens is you get back dailies, which allows the editor to start cutting and start working on the production. And these are not the actual source media that's going to be used during the final conform, but this is something that you can start working with. You can think of them as proxies, but they're really, the traditional term ever since the old days of Hollywood is they're called dailies, because they were given to you at the end of the day. They're typically given to you from the set from somebody like a DIT, a digital technician who works with the cameras, and he sets these up with some sort of color LUT or CDL or something like that, so that way it looks kind of right on your system when you're editing. It's not meant to be final color, which will be handled later by a colorist, but the dailies are set up with some sort of a color, temporary color management built into it. So this basically talks about that. One thing that it talks about right away in this chapter is the ALE, Avid Log Exchange, which is sort of a standard in the industry. An ALE file is a human readable text file with lots of metadata about each clip. So it contains all kinds of metadata about each clip, which you can get along with the dailies. And it can be opened and edited in spreadsheet applications like Excel. So it's basically, along with all the dailies, comes with this Avid Log Exchange file, this ALE. And as far as the color is concerned, you either get what's called a CDL, a color decision list, which is just a list of 4 color correction parameters: offset, power, slope, and saturation, developed by the American Society of Cinematographers. Okay, the CDL format is much simpler than the LUT formats and smaller. So you could either get a LUT, which is kind of like a color lookup table, with your dailies, which will sort of switch it into like a certain color space, or you can get a CDL, a color decision list. Because when footage is shot on a set, it's shot in a log format. And if you were to look at the color just coming off the camera, it's going to look washed out or grayed out, and it's not going to look right. And you might ask yourself, well, why would they shoot it like that if it doesn't look right? And that's because it gives you the most leverage when you're actually doing color correction and color grading. So for the color corrector, for the person doing the final color, they want that log footage. But the editor does not want that log footage because they're not going to be doing the color grading. So they just want something that looks pretty reasonable so they can see what's going on. And then later on, the color grader is going to go back to the original S-log footage, and then they're going to grade it more creatively. You can grade also in Premiere Pro using the Lumetri color tools, which are pretty sophisticated, and a lot of people do color grade their footage in Premiere Pro with Lumetri. But if you're working with somebody outside, like a color grader on the other side, they might be using Lumetri. They could be using Lumetri, or they might be using, for example, like DaVinci or some other color tool out there. Okay, so so that's what they say. Now, one thing, and then it goes on to talk about how will dailies be created. Okay, will your dailies be provided as a service or created locally in the cutting room? How will the dailies be delivered? It can come on a hard drive, or it can come through the internet. Editorial versus viewing dailies. Okay, that's sort of talking about like things are changing in digital workflows, but in general, some things never change. Then they talk about DITs. So this is, if you're not familiar who a DIT is on the set, the definition and the role of the DIT, digital imaging technician, has evolved over the years. Initially, the DIT worked with the director of photography to ensure image quality and consistency. It has come to include what was once referred to as the data wrangler and is now one role. So the thing is that the DIT is not the cinematographer. It's not the director of photographer. It sort of was like a technician who deals with the camera, setting up the camera, making sure that the camera is working properly, it's filming properly, and then also it seems to have morphed into someone who prepares the dailies to be sent over to the editor. So here's some things that the DIT might be doing: camera image setup, color space, LUT creation, receiving the camera's recorded output as well as any camera reports, and so on and so forth. Backup and archive of all materials, 2 hard drives backup, stored at different locations. So these are all responsibilities of the DIT. More information about dailies and how they're documented here in this chapter. So this chapter is mostly about creating dailies. Something that I found interesting in this chapter was this area here. Are dailies baked with LUTs or non-destructive grade? When delivering a daily to the editor or to the editing suite, you could either, bake in the LUTs into the pixels of the clips, of the dailies clips, or you could provide sort of like a clip that doesn't have that's the log footage, looks that grayed out look, and then tell the editor which LUTs, deliver like a report or an automatic script which tells the editing suite which LUTs or which CDL, color decision list was used on the footage. So what happens is that they can recreate that in the editing room. So there's benefits to either way. For example, if you give it to them with it baked into the pixels, it'll save some processing time on the editor's end. He doesn't have to think about, or she or she doesn't have to think about the color. They can just sort of bring it in and it's ready to be edited. No extra steps there, no extra processing. On the other hand, if you bring in the dailies as ungraded and with a list of the LUTs and the color grading information, the temporary color grading information there, then what happens is that it could be useful because it'll give the editor a little bit of creative control if they want to try to, change it a little bit or experiment with a different look. So this is kind of interesting section that talks about the difference of the baked-in LUTs and CDLs and the non-destructive approach. Next up is more on this ALE, Avid Log Exchange, which is the document, which is the file that comes along with the dailies, and talks about what's in it and the structure of it and the different kinds of metadata that it handles. One thing that it does that's kind of interesting, this chart is actually very useful because it talks about the ALE fields that are supported in Premiere Pro, import and export, some example data that might be in those fields, mapping into what in Premiere Pro, a description about each field, and so on and so forth. So if you're using the ALE files, this is a useful reference in this document. Next up, the book goes into how to use the ALE, importing the ALE. Using an ALE requires starting by importing the ALE first. This creates placeholder offline source clips with all the metadata. And so you import the ALE first, and all the footage comes in as a placeholder. And then with all the clips selected, right-click one of them and choose Link Media, or click File, Link Media. And this brings up the Link Media dialog, and then you link to all the media on the disk. So it's just sort of a way for you to show you how to use the ALE and link it to all the media dailies that come along with it. Displaying metadata, how to view the metadata, working with color metadata, okay? So as mentioned in the section on DIT best practices, there are two different ways of handling color in an offline workflow, baking it in or working non-destructively. So we spoke about that before, and here's some more information with it, LUTs and CDLs. Okay, so now we come to Chapter 5, Proxy Workflows. So as mentioned and as alluded to before, the editor doesn't really, in a large production or a feature film production or huge blockbuster production, they don't work with the original source media. That is kept somewhere else, and then later on that is handled by, during the final conform of color and picture when creating color picture. What's needed for the editor to work on are files that are quick, that will play back without dropping frames, so that way when you create when you edit the picture together, things go fast and you can see what's happening, things like that. So as mentioned before, dailies are kind of a proxy workflow because they're files that are not the final source media that the editor is working for. Those dailies are created on set and delivered to the editor. But this chapter goes into how you can make proxies on your own by, and a whole workflow that you can design yourself in order to make proxies. So there is an interesting diagram right here. Let me zoom that up. So as you can see here, here's the camera which shoots the footage. And here are the online source camera files. Okay, so they're all stored somewhere. And then what happened is that you create your proxy media, or your dailies, also known as dailies, because really this chapter is really, I guess, can be used for people who want to make dailies. As well as how want to make proxies. Okay, if you need to make proxies because your system is sluggish, you can use this chapter. Or if you're like a DIT or someone on set who has to deliver dailies to an editor, you can also use this chapter for yourself. So from the camera, you make proxy media dailies, goes into Premiere Pro. You do your whole edit, you edit your whole program, your whole movie, okay? And then at the last minute, you don't output actually the final picture. You output an XML file or an EDL, edit decision list, okay? And then that goes to the conforming process, which now brings back the source media files involved with it in order to conform your picture to the final picture of the movie or whatever, and you final color correction, final mastering, and so on of the audio and all that stuff. So music and all that things like that. So you can see that this is the proxy workflow, and then this is where the source media is, and then they come together using a list at the end, which then has all the time code of all the different edits, and which is used together to stitch together the conform. Okay, so now, so this chapter continues on how to create proxies, creating proxies inside of Premiere Pro, the simple way. Actually, to make proxies, it relies a lot on the Adobe Media Encoder, which is a sort of standalone little application that is used to transcode and encode the proxies from the source media over there. So you can set up the different parameters and use Adobe Media Encoder to do it. Here's a more of an advanced way in creating presets, encoding presets, and creating an ingest preset when you're ingesting the media, and then there you go. Just a little bit more of an involved way to create the proxies. Next up comes how to use the proxies in Premiere Pro to enable the proxies. As you can see over here, let me try to zoom in a little bit. In this area over here, there's a little toggle which you can invoke to switch between the proxy and the source media. Proxy status, more about proxy info in the properties panel, more like that. Scaling and transform when frame size differ. Okay. One thing that's kind of interesting is that it does talk a little bit about, I'm not exactly sure where, but I remember that, how to deal with what resolution to create your proxy. Usually you do it in a fractional resolution, so either half or quarter res proxies rather than, full res proxies. What codecs are best for proxies, because some codecs are faster than others. It's not just necessarily smaller file sizes, because sometimes a smaller file size would have a codec that is harder or slower to decode than a file that's a little bit larger with a quicker codec. So it talks about that as well. So you want to use a codec that is editing friendly, quote unquote, codec, as opposed to a codec that really shrinks your file, but needs some special hardware in order to make it editing friendly. So you have to keep things like that in mind. Okay. Working remotely with only proxies. Okay. A common technique to facilitate editors working remotely is to organize the project and media such that it is easy to take just the proxy media and leave behind the full resolution media. So a lot of times you're working with proxies, you want to go home and edit. You just take the proxies with you. You don't take the source media with you. So stuff like that. Additional considerations when using proxies in Premiere Pro. I found this interesting because if you're going to interpret your footage or reinterpret your footage, let's say with a different frame rate, than the one that came in there for whatever reason, then you can't really use proxies because the original one has a frame rate that's different than the ones that's reinterpreted. So there are things you can, all these things here that's going to mess up your proxies. So sometimes you can't use proxies if you're intending to do things like that, like reinterpret footage. Okay, so now we come to Chapter 6, working with productions. So Productions is a relatively or more recent update to Premiere Pro. And what it is that it's a workflow that was designed for large productions to work in Premiere Pro. And so let's take a look at what Productions is. So usually when you're by yourself or you're working on your own little, edit piece that you're putting together, whatever it's for, you're making a video for somebody or you're making a YouTube video or whatever, you're just a small operation, one person, usually use the project window with bins in it, and you put your footage in the bins and you make bins for audio and everything, and you drag it into your timeline and everything happens like that. Well, there's a new way of working in Premiere Pro. It's called Productions. And it allows you to organize a project with a lot of different Premiere Pro files on your hard drive that allows many people to work on it at the same time. And it's kind of like, instead of having a bin, you have a folder on your hard drive. And instead of having a sequence, you have like another Premiere Pro project. So it's a more, advanced and more friendly way to do that. So let's see what's in this chapter. So here's little, chapter contents here. Okay, so it starts out by talking about what is a production. Okay, and the way that it differs from other way. Here you can see, for example, a traditional sort of bin project window in Premiere Pro. Okay, a standard left here. Let's zoom in a little bit on this actually. So you can see here a standard Premiere Pro project where all the assets, bins, and sequences live in one project. Right, a Premiere Pro production where multiple project files live together. So you do get a panel in Premiere Pro, just like you got your project project panel. You get like a production panel, okay, and it shows you sort of, this is more indicative of the structure of your project in a directory in your hard drive rather than in your project window. Okay, so that's sort of what the difference is. So we go in there and we have, like, for example, the benefits of a production workflow. Okay, so here's the benefits: break up large projects for speed and organization, avoid duplicate clips. This is kind of a big one that is called upon when working with productions, is that when you create, like when you bring in different sequences from different files, it makes duplicate clip references in your project without when you're not using productions, and this stops that duplicate clip production. So that's kind of a big thing. Easily reuse projects, okay, and also a lot more collaboration, ability when you're using productions. So when you might ask, and then in the production panel interface, you might ask yourself, okay, so what is the collaboration like? So the thing is that if someone were to open a scene, what happens is that they get what's called first lock on that scene. So they're the only ones that are able to make changes to that sequence. And if someone else kind of comes in and tries to, make a change, they get a little lock. So you can't save any changes. You can look at it. You can look at how the cuts were done, maybe save it as something else. But you can't actually save that scene because somebody else. So you can see that here. You can see people are using this. You can see that, like, over here. You see Matt is editing this one, Marjorie is editing this one, Todd is editing this one. And something else that's kind of cool is that you can make projects that contain all the graphics, all the music, all the sound effects, and keep that as part of your whole production. And then these other scenes can reference that once. So you can have multiple projects referencing all the graphic elements, all the effects, music, sound effects, stock. They can go ahead and you don't have to have it in 20 different places. So let's move on. So you can see this is talking about project locking. If somebody's editing it, it tells you how, if you're working in a read-only project, what are the limitations? You can't do although you can't do any editing in a read-only project, a variety of tasks can still be performed without changing the project. Load clips and sequences into the source monitor, set in and out points and perform edits from the source monitor, place sequences in the timeline and program monitor, export media, okay, and copy project items into a project that is open for reading and writing. So different things like that, okay. An important aspect is it talks about shared storage systems. So it's talking about the way that storage is handled in a production. So you can read that when you get a chance. How to create a production, okay. So a little bit about XMP, which is used for metadata. More steps of how to open an existing production, build out a production, changing project lock status, making a copy of a project, emptying the trash, okay? alerts about duplicate IDs in a production. This is all relating to this production workflow, is all in this chapter. And production settings, okay? And like as I said before, understanding clips in a production. Before productions, if a clip existed in a sequence, it would always have a corresponding source clip in the same project as the sequence. Moving sequences across project resulted in all the dependent clips coming across as well, often meaning projects contain duplicate source clips. So there just was like a lot of duplicate source clip names in your project that you didn't need. Okay. Productions in Premiere Pro bring a new model of clip referencing. While it may seem like a small technical detail, this new model is arguably the most important part of how productions work. So it's important about this new model of clip referencing. A production simplified down to two projects, a media project containing clips and a timeline project containing a sequence with those clips in it. So think about that as really an important aspect of this whole production workflow. Keeping your clips in a separate project than your sequence. So that's an important concept to understand when working with productions. And then just more stuff about production, so you can read that yourself. Working how to deal with effects in productions. Okay, and then some other information about productions. So that was a useful chapter all about working with this production workflow, which once again is useful when working with large, productions like a huge feature film, like you're working on Star Wars or something, and there's so many things to deal with, so many sequences, every one is like really involved. So you would use this production approach. Decentralized collaboration with productions. This is interesting. It's kind of like how to, if not everybody's in the same place, how to decentralize your production. So it's happening over a huge distance. Updating or renaming a production. Okay. After Effects and dynamic link in productions. We're going to talk more about that later. And then this I found useful. This sort of frequently asked questions. So there's a lot of questions about production that people ask, frequently asked questions. So the next 2 pages are basically just quick questions and answers. I found it to be kind of like enlivening, so you might want to read that for sure. Chapter 7, MultiCamera Editing. If you're working on an independent film and sort of you're shooting, one shot at a time, one scene at a time with one camera, this chapter would be less for you. While all the other stuff can be useful, this chapter will be less for you. However, if let's say you're shooting a scene of a movie and there are 5 cameras set up to capture the same scene from different angles, from different points of views, one camera is moving, another camera is, from somewhere else, another camera might be with a drone, so on and so forth. Or you're filming like a reality TV show and there's like people with 8 cameramen walking around getting everything from getting different people's reactions to what's going on, so on and so forth. Or let's say, for example, a concert. You have a concert that you're filming and, there's got one guy on the bass player, one guy's on the drummer, one person's on the lead guitar, 2 people are on the singer, one of them's on the audience, another one's on a crane somewhere. Okay. So these are all what are called multi-camera shoots. And basically what you want to do is bring that into Premiere Pro and you want to edit it. Okay, so there's different, and then you want to switch between the different cameras, keep it all synced up so it's easy to do. You don't have to sync it up manually. You don't have to, layer it up on different video and audio tracks all perfectly. So this tells you how to deal with that in a relatively smooth and painful approach. It starts with talking about multi-camera editing, what it is, and how to bring all the footage in and create multicam clips. Okay, so choose a name for the multicam, choose the syncing method. So there's two ways to sync. You could either sync by time code. For example, if every camera is using the same time code, you just can sync them all up by the time code. There is also another way which you can actually syncing by audio. So by syncing with audio, it examines the waveform on each camera. Let's say, each camera recorded a different audio. So it examines, like let's say in a concert, it examines the similarity between the waveforms, and then it will automatically sync up all the different cameras based on the waveform. So those are the two common ways to sync up multicam. And sequence presets, audio related settings when created a multicam, because actually the thing is that when you're doing audio and you switch from one camera to another, you might not want to switch to its audio, okay? Because, like, for example, let's say you're doing a reality TV show, and somebody is talking, and then you want to switch to somebody who's getting an audience reaction or something like that. But the audio of the person talking is not as good as on another camera. So, you don't want to switch to their audio. So there's a lot of different ways to deal with audio when you're dealing with multicam footage. Okay, so switching the audio channels presets, you can read all of this. Setting the camera names, editing with multicams. How do you actually switch between the cameras when you're editing camera footage? Okay, so there's different ways to do that. And this tells you what to do using the multicam monitor. So depending on how many cameras you have, you can actually monitor what's going on each camera at the same time. And actually, in the case of a long form thing like live television, you could just switch between the different cameras by pressing a button. Okay, kind of like a TV switcher in a broadcast studio. So that goes into that. Switching cameras, advanced multi-camera workflows it has. Using track targeting to control multicam visibility. These are all things that you can, read up on in this document. If you're going to be doing multicam footage, this is a great place to start to be reading about and getting a lot of information from. Here we have keyboard shortcuts for multicamera editing and different things, how to deal with that, and opening multicam in a timeline mode. Okay, so how to deal with timeline stuff when you're dealing with multicam footage. Audio stuff, changing the audio output of the multicam. We talked about that a little bit before, about how to deal with audio when you're dealing with multicam footage. Selective audio editing with multicam, different audio tracks. Chapter 8, Dynamic Link with After Effects. So if you're an After Effects user, which I am, and many other people use it to create motion graphics, visual effects, special effects, animation, etc. You know what an important tool it is. Now, the thing is that usually, sometimes, or one way you could work with it is that you can create your stuff in After Effects and then render it out to a image sequence or a clip, and then bring that into Premiere Pro and put it in your cut. But a lot of times, based on what the director says or based on what you want to do, you might want to change things in the After Effects file. So then you've got to go back and you've got to re-render it and throw out the old frames and bring it back in and massage it back into place and all that type of stuff. So there's a way to actually create an After Effects composition and dynamically link to it within the Premiere Pro timeline, so that way you never really have to render it out. You just can go into the After Effects composition and make a few tweaks to it, and then it will then be reflected in the timeline in Premiere. And so this dynamic link, it can be very useful, but there are some caveats with it. For example, what happens is that it will it slows down. It can drop frames if it's very complicated with a lot of effects and a lot of layers. It can slow down the playback. Of course, there's media caching and all that, but there's issues about it. So this chapter, but it is a very important and very useful tool. So this chapter basically talks about dynamic linking with After Effects. So it's talking what is dynamic link workflow between Premiere Pro and After Effects. One thing that's really useful is there's a technique when you're doing dynamic linking. It's called render and replace. And render and replace, what that does is that allows you to render out the After Effects composition and replace the After Effects composition with the rendered footage to improve performance. And so that's pretty useful, but then you might ask yourself, well, doesn't that get back into the other problem that if you want to make changes, then you've got to go back into After Effects and make the changes, render it out, re-import it, so on and so forth? And the answer is no, because if you go to the next place, there's something called Restore Unrendered. So what you could do is you could render and replace it, but then if you ever really want to go back into the original After Effects composition, you could always say Restore Unrendered, and that will restore the unrendered file. So the unrendered After Effects composition. So that's very useful. Additional tips for dynamic linking. You could read that. Handles. Flatten multicam clips before creating the dynamic link. Okay, so dealing with multicam and dynamic linking. Guide layer. After Effects color settings, that's talking about color management between After Effects and Premiere Pro, because there are differences in the way that both applications manage color. So you can read this and get the inside scoop on that. And more about the color management, incrementing After Effects project files names, using dynamic link on a network server with multiple users. Okay. Chapter 9, turnovers. So a lot of times when you're working in Premiere Pro as an editor, you'll need to send the audio out for processing, or to the person who's doing the music, or for an audio engineer or whatever, and then they're going to give it back to you. So this process is called turnovers, and the same with the color. You might, you're dealing with the log footage or something with a temporary LUT or a temporary CDL, and you want to, send things out, bring it back as a turnover, bring it back in. So that's what turnovers are. And, you can read about best practices, audio turnovers, using AAF, audio turnover steps, all that color turnovers. You can see that that's all that color turnovers here, so on and so forth. Turning over a high resolution export to color. Okay, so in some cases where a timeline is too complex to translate between applications, or there is not time for a full conform, color turnover happens by exporting a high resolution version of the timeline with no color effects enabled, so the colorist can use that export as the media against which to apply their color. So there's an example where you don't use proxies or EDLs or XMLs for an edit decision list, that you actually export the high resolution uncolor corrected footage for colorists to use. Visual effects turnovers talks about the workflow to how to work with visual effects houses or visual effects artists, that type of turnover. Chapter 10, remote and cloud workflows. Okay, so in this increasingly remote world, whereas traditionally, you wanted to work with an editor, everybody had to be in the same house, or the director had to be in the same suite as the editor. But now with new technologies and a faster internet, things have changed. So what are some of these remote and cloud workflows? We can talk about peer-to-peer screen sharing. This technology enables connecting to and viewing the desktop of a remotely located editing machine, controlling it with one's mouse or stylus and keyboard. So for example, let's say your high-powered editing machine is located in, Manhattan, and you're out in the Hamptons, or in the Catskill Mountains, or in Pennsylvania or something like that, and you want to just edit it with it, but all you have is a laptop on you with none of the media or none of the anything else for that matter. So you can open up your laptop and you can basically use some of this software like HPZ Central Remote Boost, Jump Desktop, Microsoft Remote Desktop, Splashtop Business, or Team Viewer. And you could just sit there on your laptop and you'd be controlling your desktop, your tower, workstation tower somewhere else from your underpowered laptop. You don't even have to have a good laptop. All you have to do is have this software. So that's actually useful. Cloud storage solutions. This lets you where you can keep your media on the cloud and work with it there. Editing solutions enabling video review over the internet. This is if you want to edit and have people watch you while you edit, like a director or a client or somebody else. They can actually watch you as you edit. And then remote review and approval. Now this is actually a big thing because if you're working with a big team and a lot of people have input, this is a way. This is software that allows a lot of people to look at it, make comments, scribble drawings or diagrams of what need to be done, if there's a problem with the effects or so on and so forth, if the audio is too low, blah blah blah. It's a way for them to add their input. So one of them is Frame.io, which is now part of Adobe. That's actually a very powerful remote viewing and reviewing and approval software. But then there's other ones as well, and they're listed here. Like as I mentioned, Frame.io is now part of Adobe, so they listed that. I'm sure that it works very well with Premiere Pro. Panels and integrations, Chapter 11. This is ways that you can actually extend the use of Premiere Pro with different integrated tools and scripts and extra stuff to create, to make your life a little bit easier. There's the Adobe Audio and Video Applications feature an extensive toolkit that allows developers to integrate with, control, and extend their core functionality. This has created a thriving ecosystem of plugins and professional development, but it is also relatively easy for individuals with a technical mindset to get started with their own custom panel in Premiere Pro. Editorial teams often need specific custom behavior that they can build themselves using the tools described in this chapter. So it's kind of like a SDK for Premiere Pro, where you can develop your own custom tools and panels and extensions for Premiere Pro. So that's a little bit of sort of an advanced thing, and you're sort of, need to be technically minded a bit, or maybe not. Or maybe you could use other people's extensions. So keep in mind that it exists. Chapter 12, resources and tutorials. Okay, so this chapter, gives you a list of different helps, links, and books. How to use productions in Premiere Pro, post-production classes, and things like that. So that's actually useful. Hardware and optimizations, and then other technical information. Customer support with Adobe, Adobe technology partners, and all that stuff. So a lot of resources that you can turn to. Here's a list of the credits of those who worked on this document. And you can see some of the people that worked on this. Okay. And then that's it. So that's the whole kit and caboodle, this whole book, electronic book, Adobe Premiere Pro, Best Practices and Workflow Guide for Long-Form and Episodic Post-Production, an official publication from Adobe. To sum it up, my view about it is that I think there's a lot of good information here. I definitely would recommend it for those who want to up their game in Premiere Pro or are starting to put together a structure for a long form or episodic post-production workflow and want to know how that's done, get information about some of the technologies that are used in there, how to do it correctly. So it's really a no-brainer because actually it's free and you might as well read it. Anyway, so I'll put a link to it in the description. Thanks for watching CG Unscripted, and see you later. I'm Joe Herman. Thanks for joining me.